He seized private lands from his people and redistributed them among his supporters. He also created a police force dressed entirely in black, riding black horses, whose primary role was to crush any opposition rather than maintain peace. Welcome to the chilling tale of Ivan the Terrible, one of history's most infamous rulers. Brace yourself for a journey through the life of a man whose name became synonymous with cruelty and terror. Ivan IV Vasilievich, better known as Ivan the Terrible, was born on August 25, 1530, into the tumultuous world of the Russian aristocracy. At just 3 years old, Ivan became Grand Prince of Moscow after his father's sudden death. His father, Vasily the Grand Prince of Moscow, died from an abscess and inflammation on his leg that developed into blood poisoning. His mother, Elena Glinskaya, ruled as regent until she died in 1538 when Ivan was 8. The young prince was stuck in fights for power between important noble families, especially the Shuisky and Bileski families. The royal court became a dangerous place with lots of murder and plotting. Ivan and his deaf-mute brother Luri were treated very poorly, like street kids. There were times when Ivan and his brother wore rags and were almost starving. My brother Luri, of blessed memory, and me, they brought up like vagrants and children of the poorest, Ivan wrote in a letter to his friend Prince Kurbsky. What have I suffered for want of garments and food? Being treated badly and used in power struggles made Ivan mistrust the nobles. This mistrust grew into a deep hatred for the nobles whom he suspected of being involved in his mother's death. When he became Tsar, he would take revenge on the noble families in a big way. But for now, Ivan couldn't take his anger out on his tormentors, so he hurt animals instead. He pulled feathers from live birds and threw dogs and cats out of windows. When Ivan was 13, he finally fought back. The powerful Shuisky family had taken control of Russia after beating the Belskis. They never expected the boy they ignored and mistreated for so many years to fight back. At a feast held in 1453, Ivan accused the most powerful of the Shuiskys, Prince Andrei, of mismanaging the country and had him arrested and put to death. Some say the unfortunate Andrei was torn apart by hungry hunting dogs, though a more credible story is that Andrei's jailers beat him to death. In 1547, at the age of 16, Ivan was crowned the first Tsar of all Russia. This new title was meant to signify his absolute power, a power he would wield with unmatched brutality. 2 weeks later, he married his first wife, Anastasia Romanovna. In his early years as a leader, Ivan was more peaceful and tried to reform and modernize Russia. However, 2 events in 1558 and 1560 turned him into a tyrant. First, his great friend Prince Kurbsky betrayed him by joining the Lithuanians during Ivan's failed attempt to conquer Livonia. Kurbsky led the Lithuanian army, along with forces from Poland and Sweden, to defeat Russia, making Ivan furious and more convinced that the nobility was against him. The second event was the death of his beloved wife Anastasia in 1560. Ivan believed his enemies poisoned her. While no proof was found at the time, a 20th century examination of her bones showed high levels of mercury, suggesting Ivan might have been right. After these events, Ivan became deeply depressed, and his behavior grew more erratic. Ivan's initial reaction to the death of his wife and the betrayal of his friend was to remove himself from Moscow to Alexandrov, a town located 120 kilometers northeast of the Russian capital. Here, he wrote 2 letters indicating his intention to abdicate. His council of noblemen and clergymen attempted to rule in his absence, but when this proved impossible, an envoy was sent to beg Ivan to change his mind. He did so on the condition that he be given the right to seize the lands of those who had betrayed him and execute anyone he suspected of treason. The desperate council and clergy agreed to Ivan's demands. It was to prove a costly mistake. Ivan returned to Moscow and split the country in two, the Zemshina and the Oprichnina. The Zemshina was ruled as usual, but the Oprichnina would be governed by Ivan himself in any way he saw fit. This, it turned out, involved the torture and execution of the vast majority of his political rivals, including the boyars that he'd come to hate as a child and pretty much anyone else who got in his way. He seized private lands and redistributed them among his supporters. To police his new territory, Ivan created the Oprichniki. They were chosen for their extreme loyalty, dressed in black, and rode in black carriages driven by black horses. The Oprichniki were Ivan's personal bodyguards and enforcers, doing whatever he commanded. They were allowed to torture and kill anyone Ivan suspected of betrayal. A gang of paid thugs loathed and feared by everyone in the Oprichnina. The Oprichniki rode around with severed dogs' heads attached to their saddles to symbolize the sniffing out of traitors. It soon became a common sight in the towns and villages of the Oprichnina to see peasants, the middle classes, and the high-born fleeing for their lives as word spread that the Oprichniki were in the area. The Oprichniki were extremely ruthless. Anyone Ivan suspected of being disloyal was tortured and killed in horrible ways. Favorite execution methods included boiling alive, impalement, roasting over an open fire, or being torn apart by horses. Living in the territory ruled by Ivan and the Oprichniki meant living in constant fear. This was shown by the terrible fate of Novgorod in the infamous Novgorod Massacre. Convinced that the city's leaders, clergy, and most prominent citizens were conspiring against him, Ivan ordered an attack on Novgorod in 1570. Priests and monks were rounded up and beaten to death while their churches and monasteries were ransacked. Prominent merchants, officials, and noblemen were tortured and executed. Many were roasted alive on specially constructed frying pans. As these poor unfortunates suffered slow and agonizing deaths, their wives and children were also treated horribly. They were tied up and thrown into the river Volkhov. Any unfortunates who tried to escape were pushed under the icy waters and drowned by soldiers armed with boat hooks, spears, and axes. It would take centuries for Novgorod to fully recover from the attack. Merchants lower down the social ladder were targeted by the Oprichniki, who were ordered to take all valuable goods and destroy storehouses and shops. Anyone who tried to resist was killed, as were many who didn't resist. The poor also suffered greatly. The city was full of destitute peasants looking for work due to recent famines. Along with the evicted merchants and their families, these poor people were thrown out of the city and left to freeze and starve in the harsh Russian winter. All in all, the orgy of bloodshed and destruction visited on Novgorod resulted in the deaths of an estimated 12,000 of its citizens. With its administrative and religious structures destroyed, its prominent citizens executed, its commercial centre a gutted shell, and most of its wealth stolen, the city was so decimated by the attack that it ceased to be Russia's second-largest city. Most of the remaining population fled to find a better life elsewhere. The massacre of Novgorod proved to be the last moment in the sun for the hated Oprichniki. Ivan's crushing paranoia had already led him to begin to suspect its leaders of conspiring against him before the sacking of the city, and an attack on Moscow by the Tatars that the Oprichniki failed to repel convinced Ivan that they were not as loyal as they professed to be. In 1571, the organization was disbanded, and many of its leaders were executed. In 1572, the Oprichnina region was abolished, and mentioning the word became a crime punishable by death. Mikhail Vorotinsky, a man charged with leading the Russian army against the Crimean Khanate, managed to rout the Tatars against the odds and claim victory for Russia despite being outnumbered 2-1 at the Battle of Molody. Most would expect the sovereign to decorate the general with effusive titles, rewards, and medals for his service. However, Ivan had other ideas for Vorotinsky. A servant had accused the general of plotting the Tsar's death through the means of magic. Ivan was as paranoid as he was violent. This accusation was all he needed to turn on his general. Ivan had him tied to a stake between two fires. Ivan then personally led the torture, raking him over coals just up until the point of death before ordering his imprisonment. The general Vorotinsky died from his wounds before reaching the prison. This case shows how unpredictable Ivan's behavior could be. A trusted general who had proven valuable was violently tortured to death based on mere hearsay. Nobody, not even his own family, was safe from Ivan the Terrible. One of the last brutal acts of his reign occurred in 1581, when, upon encountering his heavily pregnant daughter-in-law in a state of undress, he beat her so severely that she miscarried. She screamed for help from her husband, Ivan's son, Ivan Ivanovich. Her husband reportedly ran to the brutal scene in hopes of helping his pregnant wife. This led to further violence. Upon arriving in the room, the young Ivan demanded to know why his father was attacking his wife, especially as he had already forced his first two wives into a convent. Ivan the Terrible was apparently filled with rage at this apparent uproar of disloyalty from his son and struck him with a staff he often carried to punish servants. The strike cracked his son's skull, and the blow ultimately killed him. In 1584, with his health failing, Ivan the Terrible became obsessed with death, calling upon witches and soothsayers to sustain him, but to no avail. Ivan died from a stroke while playing chess with a close friend in the same year at the age of 53. After he died, his body was found to have large amounts of mercury. There were speculations that he was severely ill and used it as medicine, or that he participated in some rituals that involved alchemy, or that he was poisoned. He had willed the kingdom to his feeble-minded son, Fyodor, whose rule spiraled Russia into the catastrophic time of troubles. He died childless in 1598, leading to the establishment of the Romanov dynasty. From butchering his subjects to slaughtering the citizens of the towns and cities he conquered to the killing of his own son, Ivan was terrible in both the old and new definition of the word. He had started as a reasonable ruler, but his escalating paranoia and the deterioration of his mental health from 1558 onwards turned him into a monstrous tyrant who left death, destruction, and economic ruin in his wake. Ivan the Terrible truly lived up to his name. And so, the story of Ivan the Terrible ends, but his dark shadow continues to loom over history, a reminder of the horrors that absolute power can unleash. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for more fascinating historical tales.